started on our session here now, depending on your tenant, it doesn't actually go to Stream anymore. It goes to either OneDrive or SharePoint.
GCC. Too bad. You already started recording.
Sorry, what was the question going to be about that?
Yeah, I'm going to be off recording.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I was multitasking there as we were chatting and not paying attention. Yeah, we can still go ahead with questions though, unless it's something you don't want on the recording.
See. Yes.
Okay. Hold for the end and we hit stop and fire away. Yeah, so actually that's an interesting thing to bring up in new behavior is when you, depending on your tenant, when you start a recording in Teams, it now saves either to your OneDrive or to a SharePoint channel, depending on how you've set the meeting up. And this is one I was griping with about staff today. So when you create a meeting invite, let me see if I can bring one up here to show you. So if you create the meeting invite through Teams, you don't have the ability to add a channel to the meeting invite. So let me see here.
The point is that this government entity, does not want to have anyone ever see the films. Films should be locked. Yes, and then if anything, they would have like a workflow to grant access to others, but lock it completely to begin with, if possible.
So by default, if I don't assign a channel to the meeting before I hit record,
what I thought goes to everybody in the meeting.
The meeting's going to record to my OneDrive, and nobody's going to have access to it unless I explicitly share it. If I associate the meeting to a channel and I hit record, the recording actually goes into that channel, and anybody who is a member of that team and channel, which doesn't necessarily have to be the people that are in the meeting, would then have access to the recording. And I actually like that one. That one's better because you can easily share those, which you couldn't do through Stream. My challenge is if you create the meeting through Outlook, you can't actually associate it to a channel. I don't know if you've come across this, Bill, or not.
No, I haven't gotten into that part of it yet.
I can't seem to bring it up on my tenant here, but there's a field that shows up in the Teams meeting. Actually, you know what? If I start a new meeting, I can probably do it. Yeah. So here, let me pull this across. So I've just hit the new meeting in my Teams, and there's this add channel, and I can drill down through all my teams and channels and tag this meeting to a channel, and it'll show up in the channel conversation, which is good. And the recording will get recorded in the files tab in a recordings folder for that channel, which is also good. But if I create this meeting through Outlook, not through Teams, and even if I open it up in Teams afterwards, then this add channel field just doesn't exist in there. It's not there. I don't know why Microsoft decided only if you create the meeting through Teams does it do that. Because my challenge is a lot of my meetings get created by Amanda, who's my EA. She has delegate access to my Outlook mailbox, so she can create meetings on my behalf in there. But there is no such thing as delegate access to Teams other than delegating your inbound phone. There's no other delegate access there. So cool feature, but not 100% baked just yet.
They were demonstrating on this week's Teams call, yeah. So Tuesday's monthly team call, a application that is basically a separate user that would do all that work for you.
Separate user in what sense?
It would be a meeting planner. It's a bot that would handle your meetings.
Okay.
And it would actually call you when your meeting was. So it's the way it was set up. I didn't follow it all in that much detail, but it's an app that's out there in the App Store for Teams that you can go pull together.
Yeah, I've seen meeting bots around trying to find, common time between people and stuff like that. Those are interesting.
This handles the actual meeting itself as well.
Right. Reminds you above and beyond the pop-up that, hey, you're supposed to be in this meeting, get in here.
Yeah, it would call it, and it's actually the meeting organizer in the end.
Okay, cool.
So if you create it by just Outlook, it would be a private to you, nobody else?
That's my understanding, although I'm only like day 2 into playing with this particular feature. But yeah, if you don't tag it to a channel, it gets saved to your OneDrive, and by default, that's private to you. You can choose to share it with other people from there, but it's not shared by default.
No, they don't want to share it to anybody.
Mm-hmm. So that would work in that scenario. So generally, when we kick these sessions off, we start just kind of a general welcome, hello. What I thought I'd do is maybe talk a bit more about what we're doing on the meetup side and the experience that you had coming through to actually join the session. So actually, if I come over here to TSPUG, that's crazy looking. Hollow mirrors.
While you're doing that, just cover a few announcements.
Yeah.
I can't remember what graph meeting it was. I guess it was the first Tuesday of the month, so it's been a couple of weeks. They demonstrated the new search capabilities in Graph, that you can now search SharePoint content and return it through Graph.
Oh, that's cool. So you could build your own.
Graph. Yeah, that's gone GA. That's gone GA, and there's a number of objects that it actually will search and give you the properties back for now.
Nice.
So that's GA. So you don't have to search. You can use Graph as your target for searching now. Other announcement, everybody aware there's an Ignite next month, the first week. I wrote it down. It was on the call.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that.
Yes, there is one. You can register for it at aka.ms.ignite/ignite. Or go to the search way. That's the My Ignite. Try doing the aka at Microsoft or aka.ms/ignite.
Yep, that gets you the same spot.
So that'll get you to there to be able to register. It's an online sessions again. It's 2 days. I guess it's what's the dates again?
March 2nd to 4th.
So 3 days. So 3 days. So 3 days. So they're calling a Spring Ignite.
Yeah, they've gone to doing a twice a year Ignite because the last one was back in the fall.
Yeah,
or
they
in
save
the past,
money
it's been an annual.
Save money by going virtual.
Yeah, I don't know when we're going to see an in-person Ignite again. It won't be in 2021.
Yeah. Drove by the Microsoft office yesterday and figured that'll never open again.
The Meadowvale one or the downtown one?
Meadowvale. It'll never open again because it'll move by the time it comes time to open.
Have they officially moved, or did all that pause with the COVID?
I guess the construction's gone on. They're just not moved yet.
Right.
The office is there still at Meadowvale. I saw it. Part of it gets lit up. I go by in snowy weather, so.
I think there's a for lease sign out in front, isn't there?
Yeah, there's somebody. They're trying to get the BC Employees Union wants to rent it.
Okay.
Because they just leased it for 25 years originally. So.
Right. Interesting.
There was one other announcement. I can't remember what it was from the calls this past month that was interesting, but I know what it was. On Andrew Connell's call today, it's without him giving away anything and without telling anything. Next version of SharePoint Framework is within days away, except for the one they have today doesn't work.
So they have a broken release they're about to fix?
Yeah, and there's going to be issues if your version of Node has to be updated, and there's a lot of other changes that are coming in the supporting elements of it in terms of version of Gulp and the version of Webpack are being updated significantly. So you're going to have issues if you're dealing with it, and that's being updated because that's a requirement when you move to the new version of Node. But it's actually going to be in a version of Node that's going to be deprecated, I think, by the end of this year. So.
Oh no.
But they did want to go. So there's going to be another upgrade in the next version. So they're chasing their tail, and a lot of it is not this group's problem. It's the fact that they depend on code that comes from other people that haven't been updated to support newer versions of Node. So So we're on like 8 and 10 today, and the current long-term shipping version I think is 16. So we're way behind. And if you're familiar with Node, it updates every other version for
long-term support.
Long-term support.
Much
so
like
there's actually
.NET Core now.
Yeah, it's a pattern they use, and there's one in between if you're into being really experimental. So
if you want to live on the edge.
So that's all the action on that side over the last month. But this graph stuff looks interesting if you want to do searches and you don't want to have to figure out where you're going to target, or you're trying to find stuff in graph. You can now search for the SharePoint lists and list content now that way.
Cool. So yeah, some changes coming on the TSPUG site side. So Bill and I and folks on the board with TSPUG have been chatting about moving off of Meetup. I'm kind of pushing it as an agenda on my side. Meetup's a little archaic. You know, the email engine is pretty brutal. They actually don't let you own your data, so you don't have access to your membership. You can simply send emails to them, which kind of rubs me the wrong way. I mean, the owner of the Meetup should own the data, not the Meetup organization themselves. But anyways, kind of been moving away from that. So when we did the boot camp back in the fall, we used MailChimp, and we spun up a website specific to boot camp to run that event on. And I'd like to do the same thing for the general sessions like tonight that we're doing with TSPUG. So we started that journey. We haven't gone all the way across there. One of the challenges is that we can't actually export the 1,218 members out of the TSPUG meetup group because they won't tell us who those people are, at least who their email addresses are. So that was the reason behind having the forms, sign up form for registering for this event. So when we come down into tonight's event and you get to this link here, it was taking you over to a Microsoft form and asking you to provide your information so that we can capture that in the form and use it to build out our MailChimp list. We've already got a couple hundred people on the MailChimp list from the boot camp. We basically want to transition people off of that meetup list and over to MailChimp to do that. And we're using the Microsoft form to achieve that. It's actually a cool little solution. Basically what I did was I built this Microsoft form, and when it gets submitted, there's a Microsoft flow that runs from that. So if you haven't played with forms and Power Automate, it actually work like it's a 3-line flow. It's really easy. It says, hey, when something new gets submitted on that TSPUG form, go get the response details and then just send you a calendar invite. So this is the calendar invite that everybody got with the details for the event. So I literally started this about 11 p.m. last night, wrapped it up around midnight, and built a little user acceptance testing for me early this morning, and we rolled with it from there. So you all got here, so I assume it hung together and worked from that point of view. The goal is to take that bootcamp site and turn it into a general www.tspug.com site and start managing the events from that point of view. So you're going to see us moving away from the meetup and pushing over there. We'll probably keep the meetup alive for the foreseeable future just to have some links across and maybe continue to leverage the mailing list until the majority of people are coming through the MailChimp list that came through. I should try doing a live poll in Teams here, but I'm not going to go off script too far, even though I don't have a script. But I'd be curious to know how many of you got both the MailChimp email and the meetup email. Because if you were registered for the bootcamp, you would have been on the MailChimp list and would have got that note. But you would have also gotten the one for meetup through there. The MailChimp one is a much nicer looking email and a lot easier to manage from that point of view. So that's sort of some side topic. The main topic for tonight, actually, let me just use the agenda that's on the screen right here. So this is, I think I've talked about this in past meetups that we've had. It's something I've been playing with. I've had an open source solution out there for a couple of years now that's evolved. It started as a SharePoint site provisioning solution, and it morphed into Teams as Teams came onto the scene gangbusters, and kind of addresses both of those. It touches into OneNote. We'd started looking at doing some stream stuff, but there wasn't an API for that. We've got some planner integration in there too. So kind of tying a bunch of different pieces of Microsoft 365 together. And I'm not going to go too deep into the sort of the business use case side of it. I actually did a webinar last week. So there's an event up on the Extranet User Manager website. I can send a link out to folks since we actually have your email address through the registration. But if I come into, there's a part 2 I'm doing next week, which is going to recycle a lot of the content that I'm doing here tonight. But if you're interested, there is a recording the part one there that kind of gets into the business background of why Teams provisioning is important and how you do sort of a Teams first information architecture and how that often integrates in with things like SAP or Dynamics 365 or Salesforce as part of your broader business process. That's what last week's talk was about. Next week's, which is basically what I'm stealing for tonight's session, is to get under the hood and really understand the technology underneath this and how that's hanging together. I decided to lift a couple of different topics, so I'm going to be mainly pulling from this one here, but I've got some coming up later into April and May around secure development and software development lifecycle with Microsoft 365. I'm going to touch on some of those things tonight as well. And by all means, this is, like I said, very unscripted. So if you've got questions or you want to go in different directions, feel free to either chat. I'll try and keep the chat open so I can see things coming through there, or just go ahead and unmute and start the conversation. It's not a big group, so it's quite fine to get a live conversation going from that point of view. So I will, go very quickly through a couple of the slides from last week's webinar, just to give you a sense of some of those things. This business challenge around, everybody's got thrown in the deep end with remote working. For a lot of organizations, that's meant Teams, and it's just exploded. But most of it's been unplanned. There's no consistency. Self-service is really important. Nobody likes rules. But how do we deal with that? When you actually let everybody in an organization create a team, not only are they creating teams, they're creating Microsoft 365 groups, they're creating modern team sites, they're creating OneNotes, they might be creating planners and stream groups as part of that as well. So there's a bunch of things that are getting created, and you probably want to have some process and some governance around that. So the link here for the open source solutions, I'll post the link to this deck as well as the actual recording that I'm doing tonight, I promise, Bill, and get that out there. There's also a third-party solution. If you're interested, I would encourage you to check out Michael Psarek, who's a former Microsoft MVP from out in Vancouver, BC. His startup is called Orchestry. He's got a really slick solution around the provisioning side as well. You don't have to do other of these things, but you should do something to manage your team's governance. And basically what I'm going to be going through tonight is a very simple self-service request form. So that's built using a SharePoint framework web part, and that's part of the open source solution. So we've published the code for that up there. Not current with the latest version of SPFx. Sorry, Bill, we'll have to get that tweaked and through there as part of that. You have the option of having approvals in there. So there's a Logic App workflow that we're going to dig into. And I have recently updated it to use the new is PNP Core the right term for the new version of PNP that they're pushing everybody towards?
I think
the open source runs on Linux and everything else platform.
Yeah, they changed it slightly, and off the top of my head, I don't remember.
The language is a little confusing as to what's called what, but it's basically the newest version of PNP. They've refactored a bunch of the code and removed the dependencies on Windows OS, so it is truly multi-platform.
Yeah, they're moving a lot of stuff in two directions. One is to move it so that it's platform agnostic, and a lot of it is going away from REST calls, say, to SharePoint that are already in Graph. So they're trying to use more Graph in the process as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's Orchestry there. If you're curious, I encourage you to check that out. It's a pretty slick product as well. So let's come back to tonight's agenda. I know I'm bouncing around a fair bit, but really what I want to do is dive into the technical guts of what this solution is. So we start with an SPFx web part, which allows you to do the request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what the scenario looks like, and then we're going to go under the hood into each of these components. So that SharePoint framework web part submits to a SharePoint list, which triggers a Logic App workflow. That's a piece I actually want to tweak. I'd actually like the web part to submit directly to the Logic App and have some security around that. Still working on that piece of it. So the approvals happen in the Logic App, and the calls out to Azure Automation, which if you're not familiar with it, is a great way to run PowerShell scripts like PNP stuff in the cloud serverless as part of Azure. And then we're going to go a little deeper into the Logic App workflow. understand some things that we've done there to actually make deployment a lot easier. One of the challenges that we've had on a lot of our projects is just how do we create things like ARM templates to make deployment of Azure automation and logic apps a lot simpler. And we're actually creating some scripts. I think are going to open source those as well for the generation of the ARM templates and parameterization and such. Bill, you know Jackie quite well. Others may know he runs the Azure user group. He's helping me out on that side. So we're doing some interesting work there to simplify that whole process. Getting into the PowerShell and the latest PnP stuff that I was just talking about. So the latest versions there around Azure automation, and then some of the security best practices that I touched on there, like how the web part should talk to the logic app securely using bearer tokens in Azure AD, how the Azure automation does its authentication to Graph and to SharePoint, you know, how to manage and structure that from that point of view. How do you package this up? So if you're running in a more of a continuous integration type of environment where you've got dev, test, prod, and maybe you're using Azure DevOps and continuous integration and deployment pipelines, you can automate a lot of this stuff. That might be getting a little much for some folks, but the concepts are valid even if you're not going all the way here, that you need a good way to manage the deployment and update of your solutions. And then lastly, as you get into multiple environments, having, you know, dev, test, UAT, production environments, how do you manage all those different environments? We've actually done some cool things there to help simplify that access, because we've got so many different tenants and environments that we use for all of our different clients. So that's kind of the main flow through from that point of view.
Just a quick, are you going to address going forward now MFA?
Yes, that is absolutely part of the security part of the.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that is a little tricky for people to understand.
Yeah.
And the MFA configuration requirements around the Graph PowerShell is also helpful.
Yeah, we're actually eliminating that. I'm going to talk about app only and delegated permissions and certificate-based authentication, which is where the new PnP is pushing everybody to go, which I'm keen on. You know, that eliminates all that MFA stuff. So let's actually go through the process. So I've got it in this tenant here. Okay. So this is our development tenant. It's not our regular production tenant. So it's a completely separate Azure AD, Azure subscriptions, Microsoft 365, which I encourage you to do. Don't play and use your prod tenant as your sandbox. I mean, you can go sign up for a free 365 tenant from Microsoft. They'll give you 25 licenses. As long as you keep active on it, you can use it. It's what we encouraged people to use in the boot camp. So you can go back to the boot camp site. We've got instructions there on how you sign up for one of those. We tend to actually purchase and buy separate tenants only because we don't want, if it goes dormant, for it to get deleted by Microsoft, because they will basically purge them out if you don't keep active on them. We want them always there, and for $6 a month for a business essentials single user subscription, it's worth it to keep the lights on and know that it's secure from that point of view. Okay, so what this site is, this isn't what a normal user would see as part of this. This is sort of our development site for working on the solution, and it's got navigation for all the different lists. And I won't go into every single detail in here, but I'll give you a sense of how this hangs together and what this looks like. But what we've got on the page here is a couple different web parts, and these two are actually the same web part. There are sites list web part, and they basically provide a site directory and allow you to navigate through to sites that you've created. But the one I want to focus on here is this team request web part here. So let me actually edit this page for a second. So this is an SPFx web part. We created it a couple of years ago. We've tweaked it since then. You know, it's got a bunch of configurations that you set up when you're deploying it onto your site. And this we do provide in full source code as part of the GitHub repository that we publish there. So basically it's saying, okay, you know, what site am I pointing to? In this case, I have the web part on the same site where all the lists are hosted, but you can actually drop the web part on different sites. In our production tenant, we've got it in different places. So if I'm in the partner section of our intranet, you know, I can create a new partner site with the web part there. If I'm in the client section, I have a slightly different configured one over there. It gives you some flexibility from that point of view. You know, and this is just wiring it up to different lists that we have in the site to configure it. You know, where is it recording all of the site requests that it has? What's the list of divisions? We'll see in a minute in the drop down there. You know, where's the templates? We support blacklists. So if there's particular team names, you don't want somebody to arbitrarily create a team called Human Resources. You want the HR team to actually own that. You can stick it on your blacklist list so nobody else can grab that. And there's some labels that you can override. There's some pre-selected. So if you want to hide things and say, you know what, just have a site template always there. Don't even show the option to choose it. You can fill in defaults as part of that. There's a whole API section. We built an API that goes with this to handle the requests. I'll touch on that a little bit later. But basically, I've got all those details that I can fill in through there. I'm just going to discard that though, and let's actually interact with the web part. So on this particular site, we've used the divisions list, which is just a simple lookup list in SharePoint to define these divisions. So if I have a look at what's in that list, we have things like, is there an approver for that particular division? Is there a specific prefix that we want to put on all teams that go in there? Where do they roll up underneath? Do we have a hub site associated that we should add it to? So you can define all those sorts of things as part of that. I'm going to use this temporary demos, not the approval one, as a quick run through here. And basically we've got a list of site templates that we can use. We've got another list here that says, hey, here's my available site templates. There's a whole bunch defined in here, and you can associate them with different divisions. So when I pick a particular division, these are the templates that I get there. And is this a 365 group? What's its base site? Do we have a PNP template that gets applied on top of this? So if we want to really customize the team and the site that comes out of this, you can drive a lot of that through PNP and through what we're doing in here. I'm going to pick modern communication site only because it's the simplest one. It's really quick to provision. The team sites, we actually created a new team for a new client this afternoon. It took over an hour for it to be provisioned, not because our code is slow, just because Teams provisioning is really slow in 365. You go into the admin console, you'll see warnings from Microsoft saying, hey, it could take up to 24 hours for your team to appear. I think they're just overwhelmed with adoption. So we'll keep it simple there. And you may have noticed when I was back in the divisions list, there was a prefix defined there. So any site that I create is going to have that demo prefix inside of it. Now I picked a previous, I'd already done a dry run called TSPUG1, and it's saying, hey, sorry, that URL is already in use. So it's doing a check to see, hey, does this team already exist? Does this site already exist? Let me just change that to 3. Now we're good. And one of the things I really like of what we've done is defining the external sharing as part of the templates themselves. And right now we've left these as open options that people can actually see that and change them. You can lock them down and say, okay, for this division in this template, maybe there is no sharing. That's just not allowed on this template, or this one always has sharing. You can set those sorts of rules up and have these choices pre-baked as part of that. The other thing that annoys me with Microsoft is, for whatever reason, they decided that this people with existing access default behavior is the only thing that you can't set as an organizational default. You have to set it on every site as you come in. So I like the ability to set that through here as part of this. But let me go ahead and just submit this.
Peter, does that check the policies to verify that those are the settings available, or are you just doing it without checking?
We're not checking the underlying policies that are set at the tenant level. You can define in the configuration which things are available to people to pick, but you'd have to align those yourself to the policies that you've set on the tenant. We're not doing a double check of that. Okay,
so if you had set your policy a little bit tighter, you have to make sure you change the configuration to
you would lock them down here, yeah, so that people couldn't ask for something that you couldn't actually provision. So if we look at the sites list, basically that web part, all it did was it wrote an entry into this SharePoint list saying, here's my demo TSPUG3 list item. Here's all the answers to all the various different things. Now, some of them aren't filled in yet because the provisioning script is still running, and it's going to fill in that stuff as it goes through. So let's have a look at what happens under the hood there. So I mentioned there's logic app. So this is the logic app that actually triggers off that. So it's got a trigger saying, hey, when something gets created in that list, and I'll show you the parameter details a little later as we get into the parameterization, but it's pointing to that SharePoint list that we were just looking at. And it basically initializes a bunch of variables in here. It checks to see maybe the list entry got added for an existing site, so make sure we actually need to create a site. Go get some details around that. So go look at that divisions list and figure out if there's an approver filled in on that list. And if there is an approver, then go through an approval process here first. Otherwise, just go ahead and set it approved. Once it's marked as approved, come down here. If it failed the approval, send the rejection email. And this is where it actually does the heavy lifting to actually start doing the Azure automation and creating the site. So it's calling out to Azure automation and calling out to a particular runbook that we'll show you in a minute to do the heavy lifting of actually building that team and that site. It gets some results back from that. We had a lot of challenges here, particularly with P&P running in Azure automation, that if you get multiple instances of this running at the same time, they cross pollute with each other, and things that you've done in one instance of your runbook actually show up in another one, and things start to break from there. I'll show you in the PowerShell, but we basically built some queuing logic that says, hey, if there's an earlier version of the job already running, just pause and wait and try again so that we serialize them and they don't step on each other from that point of view. So this is basically sitting in a loop saying, hey, if I come back and my result was suspended, which means somebody else was running, I'm going to wait, then it just does a delay and spins back through that loop again and just keeps trying until it's done. Ultimately, it's finished that, says, hey, did that succeed? Send an email to the person that requested it saying, hey, welcome, your request is approved, your site is created, you're good to go. Otherwise, send some sort of email and do a termination so we can actually track that from a failure point of view. So that's kind of a run through of the design side. Let's actually look at the run that just ran. So if I refresh this, oh, it's actually still running. So if people aren't familiar with Logic Apps, but you are familiar with Power Automate, so a flow, which is the workflow underneath Power Automate, is actually running on top of the Logic App infrastructure. It's kind of like the base infrastructure underneath Power Automate that builds all that. So when I was in that edit view, it may have looked very familiar to flows because it actually is the same designer. Logic App and Power Automate share the same roots from that point of view. But I can go into my running Logic App here, and I can live see how it's going through that process. So I can see, okay, it was triggered. There's my demo TSPUG 3 list item ID that I filled in as part of this that started the process. I've got all my variables. It checked to see if the site was empty. No, it wasn't. I need to actually go do it. I need to spin through and see if there's an approver. I picked the temporary division without approvers. So it's saying, nope, we don't need to go through the approval process. I'm just going to mark it as approved. I'm going to fire off this job here. So it's actually sitting in this process running the Azure automation right now. When that finally comes back, it'll complete the workflow, determine if it was successful, and send the emails from there. Usually it takes less than 4 minutes for a communication site, but the last dry run took two minutes. We'll see how this one goes from here. But while that's going, I'm going to switch gears over onto the Azure automation side. So let me step back a bit here. So let's come up to the automation account. I really should have pre-queued some polls because I'm curious who's played with Azure automation and PowerShell in the group here, and how much sort of backstory I need to do as part of this. But basically, an automation account in Azure is a place to manage runbooks, which they don't have to be PowerShell scripts. They can be Python, they can be some other things, but primarily we use them for running PowerShell scripts. So we've got a collection of runbooks that do different things in here that get executed. And they run serverless, which means you don't need to spin up a VM to run your PowerShell. Microsoft takes care of that for you. It sort of grabs the next VM from the pool, runs your PowerShell, and brings your results back from there. So they manage that whole environment for you. The PowerShell that was called by the Logic App, so this one over here, actually it's completed now. So it was calling out to the create site runbook here. So if I look at that runbook in my Azure automation, here it is here. And I can actually see the PowerShell script. So I can actually edit my PowerShell here. I personally find it a lot easier to build my PowerShell locally in the ISE environment, and I tend to build the scripts in a way that they work either way. So we'll see at the beginning of the script here, it's doing a call to get some Azure automation variables, and that'll tell me whether I'm running in the cloud in Azure automation. So if I'm in Azure automation, I take this path here. Otherwise, I'm going to load some local scripts because I'm running on my local machine and run from there. But the rest of the script is the same either way, and it lets me debug these scripts locally. when I'm happy with them, I put them up in the cloud and cross my fingers that they run the same way. Had a little bit of grief I'm still working through on some of the Azure AD commandlets that behave differently in Azure Automation than they do on premise, but for the most part, it works quite well from that point of view. And this check runbook lock, I mean, that was the code that I was referring to that checks to see, hey, is there another instance of this runbook that's running at the same time as I am? And if it is, and it started before I am, then I should go to sleep, return suspended, and let somebody call me again later to see if it's quiet and it's my turn in the queue to go from that point of view. That's kind of how that process works. We did a bunch of load testing around it. It works really well, and it solves that concurrency issue around the PNP commandlets. So basically, it comes in here. It connects up to that SharePoint site that I was talking about, finds out if there's anything that that hasn't been created that it should, or was a particular ID passed through. And this is actually the path that the Logic app takes. It passes a specific list item ID through to it, so that it can go get that item and basically provision that site. So most of the work isn't actually happening in this runbook. This is kind of managing the overall process, but the real guts of it, if we come back to my runbooks, is in this helper runbook. And I find this model works well to say, hey, let's take a bunch of common things that we're doing, like connecting to PNP, and let's do it all in this helper function. Then we've got other runbooks that can all use that same common helper function. So if we view this one here, I've got some stuff around managed credentials that gets used for when I'm running on premise. We actually don't use this much anymore because we use certificates when we're running locally as well. We tend not to use things like client ID secrets or username passwords anymore. But basically, if we come down here, like if I want to connect to PNP Online, to Bill's point, one of the things that caused us a lot of grief was that, as credential access policies and multi-factor authentication have become a big thing in most organizations, which is a good thing. It's fantastic from security. It's a pain if you're using username and passwords in your daemon scripts like this that are running without a user sitting in front of a keyboard that can answer questions and pick up their phone and acknowledge a authenticator app. So what we're doing instead is we're actually using the Azure Run As. So I'm going to show you a little deeper in a second, but there's basically an identity that's registered in Azure AD as part of this automation account, and you can grant permissions to the service principal that identity represents. And part of what the runbook has is a certificate. So if we look in here, we've got a tenant ID, we've got a client ID that comes as part of that principal connection, and further down in here, there's a thumbprint to a certificate that's used to authenticate this. We don't need to worry too much about the guts of this. Azure Automation takes care of creating the certificate and renewing it and managing that for us. We just reference that certificate, and that tells, in this case, PNP, here's the service principal that's coming in, and whatever rights are granted to that service principal, those scripts are then allowed to do as part of that. And there's similar models for connecting to Azure AD or connecting to Microsoft Teams. They're different endpoints. They have different authentication around that, but we use the same concept of that service principal certificate credential in order to do that. And as we come further down in here, we'll eventually get into a block of code around the actual provisioning of the team.
So just a question, I don't use that method. I've been using the PNP one, a login, which uses a certificate as well. But in that case, you end up creating an app. Do you have to create the app still, or is that using a default app that's already existing in a registered app in AD?
Yeah, so it's using the app that's created as part of the automation.
Okay.
So actually, it's probably good to go over there, and it's a little complicated, and this is part of my full on security talk that I'm going to be giving in a couple of months, but I wanted to touch on it here. So if I look down in, where is my run as? So is the guy with the mouse blind and not seeing run as account? There it is. Okay. So when you create an Azure Automation account, so let's maybe take a step back. Let me open a new tab here. So I'm in my Azure portal and I want to create a brand new resource. Search here. Don't always get the right phrasing for it. Actually, what I find often works better for me is, I've already been working with automation accounts here. I go to the resource type and say new from here. It already knows what type of new I'm trying to do. So it's got this create Azure Run As account. So that's creating an identity in Azure AD for this automation account. Now there are some fairly elevated permissions that are granted that by default about being able to create additional resources in your Azure portal. So you kind of have to be careful with that one. You can pull some of those back if you need to, but we're going to actually have to add additional roles in there as part of that. So let's come back in here. We've got an already existing Azure Run As account. So it's got a name. So it takes the name of the automation account, and then it just adds a hash to make it unique to the end of that. And that's what will show up in Azure Active Directory. And there's a certificate here. You've got a specific expiry. Actually, we're going to be expiring in 2 months' time. I'll have to remember to come back. I don't recall if there's an auto renewal as part of that. Some of the certs in Azure are going that way, that Microsoft takes care of that for you. I don't think this is one of those just yet. And this thumbprint is what I was referring to in the script. I don't need to actually copy this and put it into my script. I can reference it through those PowerShell commandlets I was showing you to say, just give it the service principal thumbprint, and then I don't have to configure things in each environment from there. But if I come over to my Azure Active Directory for a minute, and I look at my app registrations, this is where those apps get registered. I might have to go to all. You know what? Sometimes what I find useful is to grab the either the display name or the object ID. There's the object ID there. This is kind of the unique identifier for this service principal, that I know I'm going exactly to what I'm looking for in there. And the unscripted part is starting to come through here. Okay, where did my app go?
It's showing enterprise. You should be looking at registrations.
Well, I started at registrations and I didn't find it there. So I flipped over to the enterprise applications.
So that effectively that Run As account really is a application registration. Is that what it turns out to be?
It is, and what I need to do is maybe I'll just pick a different random one in here to illustrate the concept. I'm not sure why this one's not coming up for me. But if I grab one of these here, there's a couple of things that we needed to do, and depending on what we were looking to achieve. So there's API permissions that you can apply to the app. So by default, it's going to get the user.read that just lets it sign in and read its own profile. That's basically all it can do from there. But you can add additional permissions to the app. So I can come in through the graph, which is kind of the preferred way now to get into SharePoint. I have a choice of delegated or application permissions. For the most part, we're using application permissions here. The reason for that is if we want to use delegated, we need a token from a user signed in session. And in this context, there is no user signed in, so we can't really use the delegated permissions. So we go into application. There's all sorts of endpoints in graph through here. You kind of need to know where you want to go. Like I want to go into SharePoint, so I need to know, sites is SharePoint. And in this case, I want to create new sites and manage the site. So I probably want to give it full control access as part of that. So once I've added that permission in there, I'm going to remove it after before I forget. I also need to do an extra step, which is to grant the admin consent. It's basically saying, yes, I'm an administrator, and I now allow this application to have that rights through there. So when we're back in the PowerShell that I was showing, and it's calling that connect P on P online to say, hey, I want to start calling on these commandlets to create sites and do things in SharePoint. It's using this permission here to drive that. And it's this difference between a service principal and a user principal. A user principal is a literal person that logs in, may go through MFA as part of that whole process. It's good for users and security is good there. Service principals are never going to be somebody at a computer logging in. It's always some sort of background process like this Azure automation, and we don't want any sort of MFA as part of that. What it means is that certificate that's kind of hidden in Azure automation actually becomes a really valuable thing. You don't have to just do this through the Run As account in Azure automation. You could register an app yourself in Azure AD, grant it permissions into SharePoint like I just did, upload your own certificate, get your own private public key pair as part of that and manage that yourself. Just be really careful with that certificate that you create, because if anybody has that certificate and they know what it's for, they basically have the keys to your entire SharePoint structure, because there's no way to scope this down. You can't say, you know what, I only want this app to have access to this one site collection. It's all or nothing. There is a feature coming out.
I'm really sorry, but there is a very recent addition to this graph security model. Now it's in preview, but if you check the graph permissions for SharePoint, you'll see selected site option.
That's what I was just going to say. There's a preview feature on the site collection side, which is a nice thing. I don't know if we can necessarily use it on all tenants. I haven't seen it show up in all tenants just yet. But yeah, it'll be much better to have more granular permissions from that point of view.
The other thing, if you're going to create your own certificate, and it's not a public certificate, it's private, strongly recommend password protecting the private key.
Yeah, basically you need to be really careful with that certificate. It's a very valuable thing.
Yeah, and that way, if anybody gets their hands on it, they can't install it without knowing the password.
Now, at the end of the day, I mean, you can come to your certificates and secrets, and you can revoke that certificate. So if you realize that somebody's compromised that certificate, get in here right away, remove it, and it's useless. But if you don't know that, and somebody's leveraging it, then you're in trouble from that point of view. It is a better way, I find, than client secrets. I prefer using the certificates approach from that point of view.
There's actually a PnP PowerShell command that will set up all of that for you. I just don't remember it offhand. I know the manual steps, but I can't remember. The only
so
problem
it'll do the app registration and
it does all that. The only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't do the password protection.
Right.
At least when it was originally put out. I don't know if they've changed it to do that, but I prefer to create the certificate separately. There is a blog article that goes through all the steps quite clearly how to do it, and actually how to actually use it inside of Power Automate.
Yeah. So a couple questions there.
Sorry.
Joseph was asking about Key Vault. Dennis was answering about that. Yeah, you could use Key Vault. In fact, we used to do that in Azure Automation, but then we realized, you know what? If I come back to the Azure Automation side, it actually has its own credentials store. So if you come back in here, this actually creates a sort of a hidden Key Vault for Azure Automation on your behalf, and you can store your own credentials in here. But it's actually nicer to use the Run As and the app registration, and Microsoft takes care of all that for you. You don't have to manage the certificate yourself. It's all managed as part of that. So typical Microsoft, there's lots of different ways to do it. We found this model of leveraging the Run As account in the Azure Automation through here, and then applying the appropriate permissions on the Azure Active Directory side works really well.
If you click on certificate, you'll see your certificate where it was registered to be used.
Yeah, you actually see the Run As certificate that it was created. So I didn't create this certificate. I can add my own if I want through here, but this was done as part of the Run As configuration. So we kind of got off down the rabbit hole there a little bit. Let me come back. So we were looking at the logic app run. So the job successfully ran. We've got the succeeded that comes back from that. We look at whether that was successful. And we send an email out saying, hey, congrats, your new site is there and ready for you to go. So let's actually come back to the UI here. So I was starting on this page here. I filled out my request. Actually, if I go to office.com, And over to my Outlook for this tenant. Whoops. I love it when pages move underneath your mouse. Yeah, very simple email, but yeah, we can get more sophisticated, provide links in there and details around that from that point of view. Okay, so if I come back to my home page, we can see there's actually my demo TSPUG 3 link showing up in here. I can control click on that, and I'm in my new communication site that I created through here. Now, we didn't create a team as part of this. Part of the process is to actually build out the team profile as well. So if there's tabs that you want to define in there, you can add that into the script and structure that out. If there's things you want to do in OneNote, we support that. I've got a model I like to follow of tying sections in OneNote to tabs in Teams to folders in SharePoint and kind of aligning that all together. So you can build all that structure out for your users and make that as part of that. But the key part of the solution there is really this idea of SharePoint framework, talking to a logic app, and then logic app calling it to Azure Automation to do the heavy lifting, and calling to PnP to do all the work from there. So we kind of went down the security rabbit hole already on the Azure Automation side. On the logic app side, right now this logic app is, this web part is configured just to write directly to this SharePoint list. So anybody that's using this form needs to have contribute access to this list, which is probably a bad idea. You don't want all of your users to have access to this system list to be able to delete things and change things and break things in your tenant from that point of view. So what we originally did was we built an API that you could deploy as an Azure function, and the web part would talk to the API, and then the API had rights to talk to the list. So the end user didn't need any direct access to the SharePoint list. Kind of gives that separation from a security point of view. But it adds complexity. You've got to deploy an API to an Azure function and wire it all up and get it working. And we realized afterwards we've been doing a lot more work now where we build forms that just talk directly to a logic app. So if we look at the logic app design.
Just to raise how I've dealt with that, Peter, is I created a list like that, hid it so people can't normally see it, and when it triggers a new item, it copies it into another list in a Power App or Power Automate, so that it goes over to a list that they don't have access to.
Right.
Only the account that's in Power Automate, and it sort of deals with that level of security.
We've done that in the past, and that's definitely a way of doing it. I like the idea though of just taking that complexity off and saying, you know what, let's just build a logic app post endpoint. So if I come in here and I say, hey, I want to create actually we've got some existing ones in here already. Like we've been working on this expense form for a client. And basically it's a similar model. It's actually a fairly complex HTML form, but it posts to a logic app endpoint. So this URL here is where it's posting to, and there's a schema of data that gets posted as part of that. And this particular one is set up with a shared access secret, which is a fancy way of saying there's a big long GUID on the end of that URL that you'd need to know in order to be able to call this endpoint. But it's security by authentication. It's still not a good approach, because a smart hacker could come into this page here, bring up the developer toolbar and just look at the payload that gets submitted when the form submits and see that here's the long URL. Now I can fake it out and send whatever I want to this endpoint here. What you want to do is set up Azure AD authentication on this. So what needs to happen is when your web part is submitting, it goes to Azure AD and gets a bearer token saying, hey, I want to submit on behalf of the user that's currently signed in. That bearer token comes over to the logic app, and you add some smarts to the logic app to interpret that, and you can actually receive securely who the person that posted to you is. And you can use that as part of your parameters inside your logic app to say, hey, I know who you are, and I can now determine what you're allowed to do and whether you're trying to break rules by sort of circumventing the web part and posting directly into the logic app and hacking the system. So you can actually lock it down and prevent that kind of thing from happening. And the person that's hitting submit on the form here, doesn't need to have any access. In fact, they could even be blocked from having read access to this list. It doesn't matter because it's all going to happen through that logic app. So when the logic app is running and it's talking to SharePoint, here's an example where we're getting some data from SharePoint. It's connecting through an identity that's part of the logic app, not part of the user that's signed in. So you've got this sort of run as permission in the logic app side as well. This particular example is wired to an on-premise SharePoint, so it's going through a data gateway and Active Directory, but you can do the same thing. In fact, generally that's what we're doing is through Azure Active Directory. So I know I'm bouncing around a lot, and I may have lost a bunch of the crowd, but what I'm trying to imply is that building secure code is complicated. There's a number of things that you need to do, and a big part of that is really understanding the underlying Azure Active Directory app registration model and permissions model, because all of this is going to be feeding through as part of that. The authentication from the SharePoint Framework web part to the logic app is happening through Azure Active Directory. The logic app is using Azure Active Directory to call the Azure Automation runbook. The runbook is using its run as account and what permissions are being granted to it to talk to SharePoint. So everything's got sort of a chain of command of how it's all secured together, and each point is sort of its own little standalone security world that's solid from that point of view. So you can't jump into the middle, because I mean you can lock your JavaScript down, but it's really easy to bypass JavaScript-based logic and get directly at the API endpoint in the logic app. So you need to make sure, okay, we've applied security there, and that's working from that point there, and carry that all the way down through your application design. Questions on that side? I'm going to take a quick pause, grab a sip of water. Now, I actually debated how much I wanted to do a lot of this topic in this group versus jumping over to Jack Lee's group, which is the Azure group, because we're going to get fairly deep into that side there. But I do want to talk a bit about how we package this up and some best practices from a development point of view. And I'm going to start back at the logic app side. So I kind of breezed over this. Let me go back to the create site logic app. So when we're editing this logic app, and I popped open some of this stuff, and I said, hey, there's these site address, site list, GUID parameters in here. Where are those coming from? Well, they're coming from these parameters here. And what these are, they're different than variables. They're things that you want to define, and the way that we use them is anything that's environment specific. So if we pick this logic app up and we move it to a different Microsoft 365 tenant, what are the things that we're going to have to change in there? And what we don't want to do is have to go through, each of these things here and start updating site address lists and list names and things like that. We want those centralized in one spot. And that's really, I think, Microsoft's vision for these parameters here is to say, okay, you can put an arbitrary name on a parameter, you can define what data type it represents, and you can put a default value in for there. So things like the site address that has the URL of this site here, this URL is obviously going to be different when this logic app is running in a different tenant. So when I'm up here and I click in here, I can literally just pick one of these parameters like site address and just drop it in there, and it'll be used in there. And whatever I defined as the default value for it here, when I'm running in this mode here and just kind of developing and working on my logic app, that's the value that it's going to use, and it's going to run against my local environment. But what I'm going to want to do is to change that to something different when I deploy this to a different environment.
Just a quick question. One of the problems I've come across is that the components always use, say, the name of a list, but they actually convert it to the GUID internally.
Yeah, so you'll notice in my parameters, I actually had list GUID in there for that reason.
So you actually go through and figure out what all the GUIDs are to do that.
Yeah, and sometimes it converts it and sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be consistent what it uses where, but we have run into that. So yeah, we do have that in our parameters, I believe here. Yeah, divisions list GUID rather than the name of the list.
Yeah, because that name of the list will not work if you're doing, say, an update. you won't get the fields to show up properly if
Right.
you've used that piece.
Yeah. So sometimes you need to switch into code view to tweak some of those things. Like if I look here, this one will actually take the list GUID right as a parameter in here, but occasionally I might need to switch over. The code view is basically a JSON representation of that whole workflow that I was seeing in the designer, and you can come in and tweak things through here. Like we can see here's the parameter for the 365 connection. I can build some of that out through this JSON view. The one caution I would make is if you make changes in here, let me just do some random changes. Don't hit save because you don't know what you've broken as part of that. Always hit the designer, go back to the designer view. And sometimes it'll throw up an error over here because you've messed the JSON up, and you can say, wait, throw all that away, just do a discard and then save from there. So I find that a safer way of going through those changes. Now, if I want to get this into another environment, so I can do an export through here and I can import it. In fact, I can do import export to a certain degree, even between Power Automate and Logic App. I can build something in Logic App and turn it into a Power Automate and vice versa. There's not 100% feature parity, so there's things like approvals that are richer in Power Automate that don't translate well into Logic App, so some of that may break as part of that. But most of the steps and most of the actions are common between those two. But the better way to do it is to say, hey, what I'd like to do is actually export a template. And when they say template, what they actually mean is an ARM template. So this is an Azure Resource Manager template, which is the way you kind of script the creation of anything in Azure. It doesn't have to be a Logic App or an Azure Automation. It could be a virtual machine, a SQL Server. I mean, they all have ARM template definitions that you can use to build those out. And you can link them together and build very complex deployment templates to deploy the whole environment out. So it gives you a preview of what that template looks like. I can download it, I can sign into a different Azure, and I can deploy that template out through there. Now the problem is that what this is deployed is just the actual Logic App. So if I come up a level, what I've done is I've created a resource group for this whole section. So resource groups are a way to group common things together in Azure. So I've created a resource group that has my Logic App in there. It's got my Azure Automation. It's got all those runbooks that were part of the automation account, but they actually live as their own components. And you'll see up here, there's API connections. These are each of the different types of connections. So there's a connection to Azure Automation, one to 365 for doing the emails, and one to SharePoint for doing the SharePoint manipulations. And they each have an identity that's associated with them. You can come in here and edit that connection and reauthorize it and put in different credentials as part of that. But the main thing is when you export the ARM template for this Logic App, all you get is that Logic App. So you don't get these connections that are part of it through that. What you can do though, however, if you do what I've done and you create a resource group and you have all these resources together in this one resource group, there's an export template here that exports not just that one resource, but everything that's in that resource group. So all of my Azure Automation, runbooks, Logic Apps, API connections, everything that's in that resource group ends up in this template. And this would be a wonderful world if you could take this template and just use it in another environment. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. They haven't quite wired it together that way for us just yet. And this is where the work Jack Lee's doing for me is really helping out. Is he's kind of executing on some vision I have around how do we automate that process. Because what happens is, I really didn't dry run this part, but let's see where we can get with it. I'm going to open up our Visual Studio for a minute just to get to the code behind this. I wiped my machine on the weekend and I haven't reset all my things like Visual Studio. I don't think I'm going to get through this in time. This is probably a deeper topic to get into, but basically what we're creating is a PowerShell script that you can run and point it at a resource group. It will create that template for you, but it will also go and fix up a bunch of stuff. So those parameters that I was showing you in the logic app, what we actually want to do is map those parameters in the ARM template. So when we're actually deploying it, it asks those questions of us, like what's the site URL, the site you're deploying to, what's the GUID for the division list, and you can fill that in the ARM template, and it'll actually fix up your logic app as it deploys it and set those new parameters, and everything will be honky-dory and run from there. So it's kind of a two-step process. One is when you've got your development environment, you want to extract that out into an ARM template and do that modification to get it ready for deployment. And what we're encouraging in our process is you would take that exported template that's fixed up, and you would actually check that into your source control. So we use DevOps and Git for our underlying source repository. We take that template and check it in there. It becomes a piece of code, and it's actually really valuable because now we've got version control around that. There's no version history in the Azure portal. If I go in and change my create site logic app and I mess something up and I want to roll back, I'm SOL because I don't have a backup of that. If I've checked that template in, I can just redeploy the template from DevOps, and now I've got my working version. I restart my changes and keep working from there. So it's saved our butt a number of times from that point of view. But where it becomes really important is from a deployment point of view. We can now take that template and we can target a different Azure subscription for a different 365, because now we want to move into our test tenant or into our production tenant. We can deploy that out, and away it goes from there. Not just from an initial deployment, but let's say we do go in and we fix something in the logic app because something was broken. We have a new version we want to deploy out. We just deploy that new ARM template right on top of the resources that are already there in that tenant, and that new logic app will appear and wire up as part of that. Some of the pieces that the ARM template doesn't support is things like the runbooks don't actually get baked in. So the PowerShell that I was showing you, the actual script, doesn't become part of the ARM template. So our deployment script that deploys the ARM template also extracts the PowerShell and deploys those into the other environment as well. So we're trying to make it a very simple, grab everything out of one tenant, put it into source control, and then be able to deploy it out into another tenant from there. So I'm going to do a talk specifically on that side of it. It's more of an Azure talk, but if you're playing with things like Logic Apps or PNP and Azure Automation, it's something you should think about how you manage that and deal with that. So I'm going to be writing some articles over the next month or two related to that topic. I hope I haven't lost everybody because I've been geeking out pretty deep on the technical side here, but this idea of being able to manage multiple environments is really important to me. We've got a big project we've been working on for over a year with a large financial company, and a lot of this learning is coming from that, both from the security point of view and from the deployment side. We've got a rich Azure DevOps pipeline. They've got 6 different environments, from dev to test to UAT to staging to pre-prod to production, and checkpoints through that whole process that it needs to go through. So automating all that is just key to building an enterprise application like that. But you can leverage that just in smaller projects. It really helps you as well from that point of view. So I think that's probably deep enough for this talk, and as far as I'm kind of prepped to go from that point of view. So let me just go back and do a quick recap here. So we talked about the web part. I didn't get under the hood as to how that web part is built. It's actually got some cool features in there that allow you to actually add new fields to the form easily through content types and such without having to change code. So interesting stuff in there. It's currently submitting to the SharePoint list, but we talked about from a security form, we're actually better to post it right to the Logic App workflow and lock that down with Azure AD. Once you got the plumbing figured out, it's pretty easy to roll that into your solutions from there. The main work is happening in Azure Automation. That's getting called from the Logic App. The parameterization that I touched on in the Logic Apps, even if you don't go as far as the whole ARM template deployment side, what I was showing you with those parameters still makes it a lot easier to export and import those Logic Apps and move those between environments. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're playing with those. The latest PNP, I didn't touch on how do I get my development environment going from that side, but making sure that you've kind of flushed out your old versions of PNP and you've got the latest versions in there. They are slightly different commandlets. There's actually scripts that you can run. I don't know if you played with them, Bill. I've just read about them, that you can basically run your script through their script and it'll go and update commandlet parameters that have changed, like names and things like that, and give you a new structured script coming out from that. The automation side of it, if you want to go that far, the ARM templates, they've taken us a while to get our head around, but now that we're comfortable with them, they're a really good way of managing your deployments. And we're big fans of DevOps and continuous integration, getting that far and having deployment pipelines. Again, it's work to get it set up, but if it's a project that you're going to be doing lots of iterations and lots of builds on, it's a more complex project, it's really, really valuable from that point of view. The last point I actually didn't touch on yet, which was this managing developer access to multiple environments. So for example, let's take this environment that I'm in right now here. So I'm signed into my P. Carson at Envision IT Dev tenant account in this tenant. But generally what we like our staff to do is use their regular Envision IT credentials in all the different environments that they work in. And what we do is we set up a Azure Active Directory group in here. So I think I've got one called staff in this tenant. Yeah. So this group actually mirrors a group that we've got in our production tenant. And what we do is we sync this across. No, I have blown everything up in here. I don't know what's going on. Okay. So what's supposed to be in here is B2B registrations for all of our guest users from our main tenant into this tenant. And what it allows us to do is to grant roles in Azure Active Directory, and in SharePoint to that group. So then I can use my regular credentials and I don't have to have 40 different Chrome or Edge profiles to manage all these different identities. I use my one main work identity in all these different environments. It's a much more simple way of managing those environments. I don't have a demo set up for it just yet. I can't share the screens where I've actually built out a bunch of SharePoint lists and some PowerShell scripts that actually automates this and lets you manage multiple different tenants and your staff access into all those different tenants. But it's actually a pretty slick way of managing all those multiple environments and using your main Azure Active Directory kind of as the key to all of that through there. Because I don't know about others, but in the past, I had umpteen profiles. I've still got a bunch in here that map to a different identity for each of those tenants. It's a lot easier to say, okay, I just sign in with my regular identity and do what I need to do in the various tenants. There's still some things like going to the Office 365 admin. I mean, you can't come in as a guest into a different tenant's Office 365 admin portal. At least I can't figure out how to do that. I can come in as an owner of an Azure subscription as a guest. That works fine. So there's still a few cases where I need to sign in as the actual identity, but 99% of what we do, we can do through the guest accounts quite easily. So I've been yammering away for a while here. Thoughts, feedback, questions from the floor?
One question around deployment. If you're doing continuous deployment, how is that working with MFA? Have you had, or are you just bypassing that for now?
Well, again, I mean, we're not just using that certificate-based authentication in our solutions. We're actually using it in our deployment as well.
Okay, so you're using basically a Power Automate solution to do the deployment of any component in a continuous basis.
Well, no, we're actually using DevOps pipelines, which has its own XAML definition for deployments, but it can call it PowerShell scripts, but you can use, certificate credentials as part of that. So it all comes back to using service principles throughout, not just the solution, but the deployment of the solution itself as well.
Okay, because it's one of the areas I haven't gone back to look at mine to figure out how to get around that problem.
Right.
Also to call it, Dennis did put a link out to the Register PMP Azure AD app.
Yes.
And it does now include the password. It didn't originally, but it does now. So you can password protect the certificate.
Okay.
And that will do all that deployment. All you're left with is just having to go pull the copy of the certificate, which is a parameter on there to keep a copy, and then upload it into Azure yourself.
So if I was using Azure Automation, I would still use the run as, not this approach. But if if I was writing, say, C# code or running locally and I wanted to go through, absolutely, this would be the process I would use.
Yeah, this is intended originally so you could auto install the certificate on your machine and get the ability to do management APIs to your tenant without having to do anything special, and you don't need a user ID.
Right. So this puts it in the local certificate store on your local machine as part of that as well?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then the second link, the is this the same piece?
So the second link, the one you have open, it's my script. I've created it before that first link was available.
Okay.
So it's the same thing, but well, I like it more because I made it. And it also, at the end, it spits out the full info about the certificate in a config file with all settings, passwords. So it also spits out a certificate. And at the end, this script also adds permissions. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of this page, you should see this in Azure. Your app is granted permissions to some resources. So I believe it's SharePoint. So it grants permissions to SharePoint. It's hard to tell by looking
based
at
on the IDs, yeah.
Yeah, but I think I'm 90% certain it's SharePoint. So that's something that the first link doesn't do. This one does.
So the first link it would do all the app registration, but it'd be up to you to go into the portal to then assign whatever API permissions you wanted for it.
I think so. I'm 90% certain. And also, beside that, I used to have some problems with using the first script. I don't honestly remember what the problem was, but I just ended up not being able to use it for some reason.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
This needs to be downloaded as just 4 or 5 files, and you just double click the batch file and it might ask you something. But yeah, it's basically double click experience.
Yeah, the whole Teams provisioning solution that I used as the example for this talk, I mean, my goal is to turn the ARM template that comes out of that process into an Azure Marketplace that you can just deploy it into your tenant. The challenge is how do you bootstrap that process and get all the roles and permissions assigned to it for it to be able to do what it needs to do. One of my thoughts is to have the user go in and assign a couple of permissions to the app that gets created, and then just run sort of an install run book that's there to say, okay, now that I have the rights to do all the other things, now I can go and set everything up that I need and go from there.
Exactly.
And then it's a functional system.
So I've just kind of uploaded this script as a part of the larger deployment solution. This is a gateway to the full deployment with all ARM templates and whatnot. First step is always to get some permissions for the client. And usually the biggest problem with clients, and especially large clients, is to create well, deployment guides and explain in details what needs to be clicked. And this script, as a result of hard work with many clients, where I decided that it's just easier to give them this double click experience.
Yeah.
They get this app automatically created. This app gets permissions automatically. And then next, because it's just the first step of your deployment, then another part deploys the rest of your Azure resources and whatnot. But this is just a gateway to getting your app deployed.
So if you don't mind, I might be reaching out to pick your brains more on this.
Sure.
This is all in line with what I've been having Jack help me out on, but there's a bunch of ideas here I think that align well with what we're trying to do as well.
Okay.
Other questions, comments from the group as a whole? So Bill, I will endeavor to delegate and have somebody else get the video uploaded so we can share that. Now, one of my griefs with Meetup is it doesn't actually let us update the event after the fact, but I can put a note in there, just in the dialogue under the event, to say here's where the link is. But it will be in our regular TSPUG YouTube channel from there. I can put a link back to the first webinar session as well that has the deck that I was sharing at the beginning. So if you want to have a look at that or the recording for that, all the resources are there as well.
Yeah, I joined the channel, so I'll get notified when you put it there.
Okay, perfect. Now, Bill, do you recall from our last group conversation, do we have somebody queued for next month, and what is our topic?
I can't remember. I know I committed, but I can't remember. I don't think it was March. I think I was going for April, but
there was somebody for March. I was just drawing a blank on who it is. I actually remember us debating, should we keep with the third Wednesday of the month because it's March break week, and then March break is moved to April anyway, so that's kind of a moot point. So I think March 17th should be fine for everybody for our next meetup.
it's not like anybody can go anywhere either.
Exactly. we're all living Groundhog Day, rinse and repeat. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll see everyone next month.
Thank you very much, Peter. Bye.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, guys. Zeros. Speaker still there? No.